let's start the show. You already know who it is. My name is Mike Kyle, aka the Fantasy Vulture. I have over a decade worth of fantasy football experience, and I've continuously competed for fantasy championships over the course of the past 6 seasons. But enough of me. I'm here for you. On today's episode of the FV Show, we are continuing our All-32 NFL team preview series, taking a look at every NFL team through the lens of fantasy football. But before we get started with the San Francisco 49ers and the rest of the NFC West, we're going to need 3 quick things from you. First off, smash that subscribe button, power running back style, to show your support for the channel, and that way you never miss a video. Also, hit that like button like an open receiver downfield, Patrick Mahomes style, to show your support for this video in particular. And last but not least, you can shoot me a text, 330-302-1554, my hub for all of my fantasy advice this season. That is the best way to get in contact with me. But you can also check out the website, ffvulture.com, and at ffvulture on all social media platforms. But let's just jump right into it. I'm ready to go. I'm fired up. This is the second video I'm recording today, so we kind of changed shirts a little bit. But regardless, we're going to talk about the San Francisco 49ers, a team that made it to the Super Bowl, had a lead in the Super Bowl, and then blew said lead in the Super Bowl. This offense is really interesting, especially when you go back through and you take a look at who played well and kind of how this season is going to shake out compared to last. And we have to start off by talking about Jimmy Garoppolo, because Jimmy Garoppolo was very good for fantasy for you last season. His 2019 finish was quarterback 14 overall, so he wasn't necessarily a starter in your league, but if you had him on your bench, if you had a guy out with injury, Jimmy G was pretty suitable for you. At least that's what you think, because he finished at quarterback 14. But then we go into the weekly finishes, and that kind of depicts a little bit more of the story of what actually happened with Jimmy G. He had 5 games as a QB1, which means you were really, really happy starting him 5 weeks. He had 6 games as a QB2, where you were probably like, meh, you were fine, you weren't killed by any means. So you were above water, but just kind of barely above water. You were kind of just floating, I guess we'd say. And then he also had 5 games as a quarterback 3, and he absolutely just tanked your team for 5 weeks. Taking that a step further, you look at his stats and you're like, wait, like these numbers are actually like pretty good, right? So 326 passing completions, 476 pass attempts, just barely under 4,000 yards passing, 62 rushing yards. He's not a mobile quarterback. We've seen him tear his ACL running the ball before, so he's probably going to avoid that at all costs now at this point. But 28 touchdowns and 13 interceptions, like that interceptions number is a bit high, but regardless, he's throwing for damn near 30 touchdowns, excuse me. So, like, that all, like, on paper, like, that looks pretty good. And that's why it's very important that I do show these weekly finishes, because in total, it looks great. But then when you break it down week by week, and that makes it a little bit less so. And the adjusted score proves it a step more as well. 16.27 points per game, played all 16. But then you factor that in, and he's now quarterback 22. And quarterback 22... blatantly is not very good. You aren't even considering starting quarterback 22. And this was a team that made the Super Bowl last year, and like Jimmy G is probably a better real life quarterback than a fantasy quarterback, and that's what we have to depict him as. He's going to be a guy, he's very, very similar to being a game manager and fulfilling that role. He does it very well. He's not going to kill you, but he's not going to really boost you over the top. And I'm sure there's an argument about, comeback wins and things like that. But that's not the point for fantasy football. If we had points for comeback wins, Russell Wilson and Derek Carr would be drafted 1 and 2 overall at the quarterback position, right? So with Jimmy G this season, it's a bit tricky because of what happened last year, right? I'm sure a lot of people have their perception skewed by that Super Bowl run. But I expect a bit of regression for this 49ers offense. The pieces they're fine. They have a few good ones, but I don't really know what to make of this offense. And just like the bizarre thing too is they were like the second highest scoring offense all of last season. And that just doesn't make any sense whatsoever. So looking at the offensive weapons around him, Raheem Mostert and Tevin Coleman in the backfield, who we're going to talk about in just a moment, as we always do. But neither one of them are real pass-catching running backs. Jerick McKinnon supposedly is going to be involved finally after signing that monster contract a few seasons ago and him being perpetually injured the past 2 or 3 seasons. And so he might get some of the passing work. Deebo Samuel broke his foot. We're going to talk about him as well. Just an incredible young wide receiver, extremely talented. So he's going to be the number one option on this team, but I don't know how much he's going to provide coming off of injury. Or I guess really he's the best. He's the number one wide receiver because the number one option on this team is George Kittle, who's going to have over 1,000 yards again. He's just an incredible tight end and one of the best tight ends already ever in just a few seasons in the NFL. And then their rookie, Brandon Aiyuk, who we're going to talk about as well. So this team doesn't have a whole lot of offensive firepower, though, all things considered, especially in the passing game. And that's what really worries me about Jimmy Garoppolo in particular. He's already a guy who's just kind of just a standard NFL quarterback, and the weapons around him don't really boost his ceiling all too much compared to a guy like Derek Carr, Teddy Bridgewater, or Drew Lock, who I kind of have all around that same range, around that quarterback 25 to like 28, I think I have them all at. So with that being said, I don't see Jimmy Garoppolo being a viable fantasy starter, especially in single quarterback leagues. Now, if you're in a super flex, that's a little bit of a different story, where I'd love to take Jimmy G. Just because having that second quarterback for me, I would always play that position as kind of just, I just want somebody safe. I want somebody steady who I know can get me 18 to 20 fantasy points every single week, and I can expect that pretty much weekly from Jimmy Garoppolo. I know his average was just 16 last season, but I do expect that to go up just a little bit because it is another year in the offense, another year where everybody's more comfortable in the system, and there wasn't a whole lot of offensive turnover going into this season compared to last. Now let's talk about the running game, and we're going to start off with one of the hottest players among the fantasy community, and that is Raheem Mostert. Now, if you know about Raheem Mostert, you know that last year wasn't an anomaly. This happened a little bit 2 seasons ago as well, so none of us that are deeply involved in fantasy should be surprised about what has transpired. So Raheem Mostert last season really just came onto the scene after just showing glimpses of it all in 2018. In 2019, he finished as running back 20 in standard, running back 24 in PPR. He only had 137 touches, 14 receptions, 772 rushing yards, 180 receiving yards, and 10 touchdowns. And that's really the big focus for Raheem Mostert. He's an extremely touchdown-dependent running back, which sucks, but if he's able to get in the end zone 8 to 12 times a year, like, you're going to be happy. And in an offense like this that does rely on the run so heavy, there's a very good chance that that does happen. In 2019, he had 5 games as a running back 1, 2 games as a 2, and 1 game as a 3. So for the most part, I mean, like, obviously, so here's the thing that we have to point out, right? So he played in all 16, but he really didn't get the opportunity until later on in the year. So just for context, I am going to pull up where those finishes took place. Give me one moment. Let's see. Right. So he barely did anything the entire first half of the season. From weeks 1 through week 11, he had 1 finish as a running back 1, 1 finish as a running back 2, and 0 finishes as a running back 3. So for the final 6 weeks of the season, that's where we really have to look at Raheem Mostert. That's where he had 4 games as a running back 1, 1 game as a running back 2, and 1 game as a running back 3. So that is really where you have to take the bulk of the sample size from. And then obviously you had the monster 200-yard rushing performance against Green Bay in the playoffs where he just absolutely carved them up. So Raheem Mostert for me is a super talented running back. However, he does kind of fit that Derrick Henry mold. That's not saying that he is Derrick Henry, but just the fact that he's just going to be a guy who gets the majority of the groundwork, but isn't really a factor in the receiving game whatsoever. And so that does give him a hard cap on his ceiling. Going through the adjusted score, 9.9 points per game, 16 games played, new finish of running back 30 in PPR. And once again, that really just comes down to the fact that he doesn't get the receiving work that he has to in order to become a firm running back 2 in fantasy. So that really was why I also have him ranked as running back 24. Just because I don't believe that passing work's going to be there. I still think he's an extremely talented running back, and he is going to get an increased workload this season. Compared to last season. I mean, 137 touches is nothing, especially when we are talking about the fact that he really did everything. All of his numbers came from a final 6-week stretch and onward in the postseason. But obviously, we don't play in postseason, so we don't really talk about that all too often. But I'm really excited for most of this season. That 6th round ADP, that late 6th, early 7th feels really good, especially at running back 28. I feel like that's just a super safe spot to take him. You'll already have your first 2 or 3 running backs already selected based off of how you draft. So having Raheem Mostert as a flex option or as a player on your bench that you can pretty much substitute as a running back 2 or a flex play week in and week out. I really love Raheem Mostert as a depth piece for you this season in a year that's going to be completely built upon utter chaos. He's just a super safe option for me. I love his role in the offense, and you know that he's going to get the ball quite often. He has the talent to produce and potentially produce double-digit touchdowns yet again. So I'm pretty much all in on Raheem Mostert in 2020. However, one player that I'm not really all in on is Tevin Coleman. In 2019, he finished as running back 32 in standard, 36 in PPR. 1 game as a running back 1, 4 games as a running back 2, and 2 games as a running back 3. He had the same amount of touches as Raheem Mostert as far as carry-wise, and then he only had 7 more receptions. I believe it was 7, right? Let me double check. Yeah. He had 7 more receptions than Raheem Mostert. And that's the thing, right? Raheem Mostert, barely was playing the first half of the season, and he still got the same amount of carries and just 7 less receptions. So, Tevin Coleman, I know I'm sidetracking based off of the stats, and I'll quickly fly through these. 544 rushing yards, 180 receiving yards. So that's the same amount of receiving yards, I think, as well. Yeah, the same amount of receiving yards and 7 touchdowns. When we came into this offseason, at this time last year, Jerick McKinnon was already ruled out, and this was Tevin Coleman's job. And Tevin Coleman did absolutely nothing with it. And it was so infuriating because we know what Kyle Shanahan can do with a good running back. We've seen it year in and year out. And Coleman, for who knows how long, again, just can't seem to produce consistent numbers. And it's so infuriating because Tevin Coleman he should be a super talented running back. But throughout his NFL career, even just going back to his days with the Falcons, he was always been just a guy, right? Tevin Coleman was supposed to be the leader of the Falcons' backfield before Devonta Freeman took it over. And they were both drafted in the same draft class, I believe, if I remember that correctly. And Coleman was drafted first, and just Devonta came in, and he just took over, leaving Tevin Coleman as the second man in the running back by committee in Atlanta. And now it looks like it's happening here again, too, where Tevin Coleman came into San Francisco with the opportunity to be the lead back, reuniting with Kyle Shanahan. And here comes Raheem Mostert just trotting on in and stealing his job. So I'm not really excited about Tevin Coleman this year whatsoever. That said, we do know that Shanahan likes to use 2 running backs. So if anything were to happen with Mostert, you are getting a guy who is already naturally going to get work, and then if Mostert goes out with an injury or catches COVID, whatever the case is, Coleman's going to kind of see that volume increase there as well. So Coleman for me is just a guy that probably has weekly flex play, but I don't think you're really excited to play him at all. I have him ranked at running back 33, so that slides in as a fringe, or just barely on the inside of being a running back 3. His ADP is running back 34 going in the 8th round, so so I am in line with ADP in terms of that. I'm very curious who is going around Tevin Coleman right now. Let me pull this up. So going around Tevin Coleman, I'm just going to read you off some names, and I'm going to give my take on who I would rather have. So in the 8th round, running back 34, At 35, you have Cam Akers. At 36, James White. 37 is Darrell Henderson. 38 is DeAndre Swift. 39 is Alexander Mattison. 40 is Phillip Lindsay. 41 is Jordan Howard. I'll tell you right now, I'd rather have Jordan Howard over Tevin Coleman. Jordan Howard, we're going to talk about him way down the line when we get to the AFC East. Love Jordan Howard this year. Cam Akers, I think, is a super interesting candidate to take over Tevin Coleman just because of the upside in that Rams offense. I'm lower on Darrell Henderson compared to Cam Akers, so I'd rather take. My order for those three would then be Akers, Coleman, Henderson. James White in New England with Cam Newton. That's an interesting combination that I'm thinking about. Just because James White fills that receiver role that Christian McCaffrey had in Carolina. We saw what Cam can do when throwing check down to a running back. That really made Cam's numbers inflate just a little bit and made his numbers look really impressive. So there is that option. Tevin Coleman or James White. Who do I have ranked higher? If I had to guess, just going off of name, I'd probably have Coleman higher. But let me just take a look here. I have them back-to-back. So I have Coleman one spot higher than James White, but I do have them back-to-back in my rankings. I have DeAndre Swift over Tevin Coleman. I have Cam Akers well above Tevin Coleman. Let's see. Where do I have Darrell Henderson? I have Darrell Henderson well below Tevin Coleman. But I do think you're entering where you're drafting Tevin Coleman, you have to ask yourself this question, right? What is the upside of the other guys going around him? And then secondly, what are you looking for? Because you can take your shot on a guy like DeAndre Swift or Cam Akers if you want to take your shot on one of the rookies, right? Or if you want to go for that upside. Or you can kind of play it safe if you just want a guy that you can kind of plug in and week out, and then you can go with that Tevin Coleman, James White, Phillip Lindsay, or Jordan Howard, like that array of guys. Or that's also the range where you start looking at handcuffs. Potentially Alexander Mattison, Kareem Hunt, guys like that, Latavius Murray. So that's what gets really interesting about as you develop later on in the draft, especially when you pretty much get past round 6 or 7, where the majority of your starting lineup is filled, and then you're shifting towards drafting bench guys. The question really becomes, how do you want to build your team? This year in particular, I'm drafting depth pretty much more than anything. I've said this over and over, just because we don't know what the season looks like or how it's going to shake out, and I'd rather be prepared than not. So with that being said, Coleman's a little bit interesting in that way because he is a guy that is going to get work. I just don't know how productive he's going to be with said work, and that kind of worries me, especially in an offense that while it thrives very differently than traditional offenses that just hang points up on the board. This is a little bit more methodical in their offensive approach. But that's all I got for the running backs in San Francisco. Now let's talk about the wide receivers who I have thoughts about. Let's talk about the guy that I love, and that's Deebo Samuel. Deebo Samuel, shout out to him. I do play in a Week 17 championship, unfortunately. But he did come through in Week 17 for my last season, so Deebo is now my guy. Deebo, my hero. Ooh, I kind of like that. Deebo, my hero. Big fan. There we go. First nickname of the show. All right, shouts to him. So in 2019, he finished as wide receiver 26 in standard and wide receiver 29 in PPR. He had 3 games as a wide receiver 1, 5 games as a wide receiver 2, and 1 game as a wide receiver 3. 81 targets, 57 catches, 802 yards, 159 rushing yards, and he is one of the only players that I get to put that rushing yard stat into because of how many jet sweeps and just how many trick plays that they run in that Shanahan system. And then he also had 6 touchdowns as well. His adjusted score, 10.7 points per game, 15 games played, new finish of wide receiver 33. And for me, Deebo Samuel is a guy, he's extremely talented, and the way that he plays, I think, makes him extremely viable fantasy. He's a yak monster, yards after catch, and that's what has me really excited for Deebo, because in this offense, it's just what they do. Like, Jimmy G just throws over to the middle. Like, Jimmy G is not going to be the one that makes the play. He's going to leave it up to the receivers to make the play for him. And what we have to talk about right now is Deebo Samuel's ADP, because we saw last season, if you put on any sort of 49ers game, you saw how Deebo Samuel was almost head and shoulders better than nearly everybody else on the field. He was just super impressive all year long. So Deebo Samuel right now broke his foot. He's currently in recovery. A report came out just a few days ago that he's likely going to miss potentially like the first 2 weeks or so. They aren't setting a timetable for his return. The initial diagnosis put him right around week 1 would be his return date, but I think they're going to take it slow, especially with how this year is shaping out. So I wouldn't expect him to really come back until week 2, 3, or 4 even. So the question becomes, when do you draft Deebo Samuel? Right now, he's still being drafted at wide receiver 24 in that 5th round. And that's the ADP that I use is Fantasy Football Calculator, just because I love the data sample that they give you and the range of which the data was taken from. So once again, I'm just pulling this up, just make sure nothing really changed. Yeah, so he's still going at 504 at wide receiver 24. I have him ranked at wide receiver 37, and that's simply just because I don't know how much time he's going to miss. If I knew that Deebo Samuel was healthy, he's probably easily around where his ADP is. If I had to take a guess, I'm gonna pull up my rankings real quick. So if you told me today Deebo Samuel's playing all 16 games, where would I have him ranked? I can tell you right now, I would have him ranked at wide receiver 23 or 24 because I think he fits that tier gap where he would be the final piece in the tier of Tyler Lockett, DJ Chark, and DK Metcalf along with Courtland Sutton. And he would be that tier gap break between those set of guys and then T.Y. Hilton, Terry McLaurin, Devontae Parker, A.J. Green, Stephon Diggs, Keenan Allen. So I feel like that's really like where he would slot in. But unfortunately, just the uncertainty with Deebo Samuel as far as when he's going to be on the field, I'm not comfortable spending a 5th round draft pick on that. For me, I would not draft Deebo Samuel probably until the 7th round. He would have to fall to me there. And the reason being is if I go 4 rounds, right? If my first 4 picks are 2 running backs and 2 wide receivers, that means that my 5th round pick is going to be a flex option. And I'm not wasting a 5th round pick on a guy that's going to play anywhere between 12 and 14 games this season at a minimum, right? Or at a maximum. At a maximum 12 or 14 games just based on whatever his injury timeline is. That's not, you are essentially lighting your 5th round pick on fire for a 4th of the season. And that terrifies me because that 5th round pick, that is a starting position. That is when you need to get a guy that you know is going to be consistent or can hit or has just a very good fantasy outlook for the season. And with Deebo, you're not getting that. So I would rather wait until probably I'd say round 6. I know I said 6. I know I said 7. I'm going to change that to 6 because after 5, if you go running back, wide receiver, and then whatever you decide to fill your flex in with, then you're drafting bench guys where you know that you won't need one of those first 5 spots filled for the opening weeks of the season. You can then just kind of stack your bench, and having Deebo as the first one off that bench, to me, feels really appealing just because I know that I'm not going to have to substitute his slot for the first few weeks of the season if he were to miss. Overall, I love Deebo. I love Deebo the talent. I love Deebo the player. He's just an incredible fantasy. He's going to be an incredible fantasy wide receiver, but he's already just a super talented wide receiver in the NFL, period. I'm just pumping the brakes on Deebo this year with all of the uncertainty. But let's talk about the player that they drafted, the wide receiver that they drafted, because this player, Brandon Aiyuk from Arizona State, was a bit of a surprise pick for some people. So the 49ers had a pick earlier in the first round, and a lot of people were saying they're going to take a wide receiver, and they kind of had their pick of the litter between CeeDee Lamb, Henry Ruggs. Wait, did Ruggs go? It went, Ruggs was off the board. I need to pull up the draft order now. Give me a sec. Regardless, they had their NFL Draft 2020 pick back on. All right, so they had their pick of the litter at wide receiver, and this, as many of you are aware, this wide receiver class was one of the best in NFL history. So they had their pick of the litter, between Jerry Jeudy and CeeDee Lamb and everybody else that wasn't named Henry Ruggs. So what do they do with their first pick? They draft Javon Kinlaw out of South Carolina, defensive tackle. All right, fine player, whatever, but you're looking at this team and you're like, they probably need some receiver help. Deebo Samuel's great, but is he going to be the number one option on a team? He kind of fits more so the role of being a number two. So what do? They draft Deebo Samuel light, Deebo Samuel's clone, Brandon Aiyuk out of Arizona State. Brandon Aiyuk is the exact same player as Deebo Samuel, and I'm not making that up. It is unbelievable how small their differences are. These are both guys that you just give them the ball in space and you let them make the play for you, which fits that Jimmy G style of get the ball out quick. Once again, Jimmy G is not going to be the one to make the play. He's going to let his pass catchers be the one to make plays for him. So it was a really interesting thing that they're doing here, right? If you look at Jimmy G, you know that he loves to just throw that ball over the middle. And so now you have Deebo Samuel running slant routes over the middle. You have Brandon Aiyuk running slant routes over the middle. And you have George Kittle running straight through the middle. It's going to be really interesting what this offense looks like for these players. Because for me, it's going to be very Drew Brees-esque, I feel like. Very New Orleans Saints-like, just in their approach. I know I talked about this in my Saints preview where I was saying things like, their whole game plan is basically give the ball to out routes from the running back position, just little quick dump-offs, or Michael Thomas is just going to go with 6-yard slants. Jared Cook just is going to go over the middle. Emmanuel Sanders on the outside just doing short work there. So it reminds me a lot of the Saints offense in that way. But when I was watching Brandon Aiyuk, maybe it's just because I like Deebo so much, and this is going to sound really weird in just a second, but I didn't see it with Aiyuk. I really didn't. I just felt like he was just a guy. He was just a wide receiver. He didn't do anything special in particular, but he was just one of those guys where give him the ball, he will probably make a play out of it. But he doesn't look spectacular. On the field. I just felt like there was an oomph missing from his game, and that's why he was quite a bit lower in my dynasty rookie rankings compared to some of the other wide receivers. I actually think he's the lowest. Where do I have him ranked as far as my dynasty wide receivers go? This is the first time that I'm bringing up my dynasty rookie rankings here, so just give me a moment. I don't think I've ever brought them up. Let's see. All right, so I have Brandon Aiyuk as my. This probably has to be updated, admittedly, but just based off of my formula, I have him ranked as my 26th rookie of this draft class. He's just a guy that I'm willing to be wrong about. But let's talk about this season, right? Because he's being drafted in the 14th round, essentially free at wide receiver 63. I have him ranked at wide receiver 64 for this year. Brandon Aiyuk is going to be the number one option, or the number one wide receiver option for this 49ers offense if Deebo Samuel misses any time. Now, what does that mean? I don't know. I truly have no idea what to expect from Brandon Aiyuk if he's just thrown in to his first NFL game as the guy on the outside. What's going to happen there? Are we going to see Deebo Samuel again, as in the exact same player that we saw Deebo Samuel last year, just in Brandon Ayuk's body? As I just said, these players are just super similar in that way. So Brandon Aiyuk to me is kind of a guy where if we get word that Deebo Samuel is going to miss the first 4 weeks, I would absolutely spend my last round pick on Brandon Aiyuk, start him for 4 weeks. Probably start him from week 2 to week 4. I probably wouldn't start him week 1 just because that's always a scary situation with starting a rookie during their first ever NFL game. But then I'd just flip him. I'd get his value as high as it possibly can be, and then I'd just flip him for another piece that I realize that my team is missing because you're spending that 15th round pick. So what's going to end up happening is you'll find out that you need other positions filled by week 4. Maybe your running backs didn't pan out how you thought they would pan out. You can then trade Brandon Aiyuk for a solid running back, and that is a super intriguing strategy for me this season. So overall, I don't love Brandon Aiyuk by any means, but I understand the potential value that he could have, and that has me mildly intrigued about him late in drafts. But let's talk about the actual number one option on this offense, and that's George Kittle, who has burst onto the scene in ways that maybe we haven't seen a tight end ever before, because he is just that good. 2019, his finish was tight end 3 in standard and 2 in PPR. He's just an absolute machine. A shade under 13 points per game, 14 games played. New finish of tight end 2, so no change there. 11 games as a tight end 1, 2 games as a tight end 2, and 1 game as a tight end 4 or worse. 107 targets, 85 catches, over 1,000 receiving yards, and 5 touchdowns. I was thinking about this before I went live, just kind of getting my thoughts in order about what I was going to say about each player. And I have him ranked at tight end 2, and his ADP is currently tight end 2 in the second round. Yo, I would not fault you whatsoever if you took Kittle over Kelsey. And the reason why is, yes, that Kansas City offense is better, but that Kansas City offense has a lot more mouths to feed than the San Francisco offense does. And so if you're going to give me a guy like Jimmy G, who, yes, plays more game manager-like, but also throws to the tight end position a lot. He obviously has a great connection with Kittle, and he throws over the middle. As I've said for the 15th time this video, I need to stop repeating myself there because you guys get the point. I see the world where, and George Kittle is also just the sure-cut number one option on this team. I see the world where if you take George Kittle as the number one tight end over Travis Kelce, I wouldn't fault you for it whatsoever. In fact, I'm almost leaning towards that right now, like as I'm saying it out loud again. Because his targets, if Deebo misses, are going to go up. His catches then naturally would probably go up. That yardage would then go up. And I think that touchdown number of 5 is just so lackluster that that's going to have natural positive regression regardless of if Deebo misses time. You know, George Kittle could easily finish with 8 to 10 touchdowns this season, and that would shock nobody at all. And the thing with Kittle, too, is he is such a positional advantage because you are getting those 11 games as a tight end 1. And it's not like he's finishing at tight end 10, 11, or 12 to get those. No. He's finishing in the top 5 week in and week out at the position. He is that valuable for your team. But the question always must be raised is, are tight ends worth it in the second or third round? Is it worth it to take a tight end that early? And once again, that's really just based upon team preference, team composition, and how you see fantasy football, whatever your own personal philosophy is. For me, I don't see the true value in it until this season. This season in Dynasty, and really when I had Mark Andrews just in every league this season, I saw the value for the first time maybe ever in going tight end early, because you don't have to worry about picking a tight end up every week to stream, or you don't have to worry about just having a fringe player where you might not get production, where it's kind of hit or miss on if you get the points that you're looking for, usually being touchdown dependent. So having a guy like Kittle, like Andrews, like Kelsey, like Ertz, where it's kind of just set it and forget it for all 16 weeks of the season, that's a really nice luxury to have. But spending a second or third round pick on it, like a second round, absolutely not, most likely. I don't think I would, because personally, I like to start off my drafts either running back, wide receiver, or running back, usually the latter. So I wouldn't sacrifice that depth, that running back depth there. But you could probably make the argument where you can go running back, tight end, just because of how deep the wide receivers are overall. I don't know if that would hurt you too much. Just my personal preference, though, I like to wait on tight end. I think the values there are just a little bit, the value in the back end of drafts is just a little bit better, because you can still scoop up a tight end 1, and while you aren't going to get the game-breaking performances from those guys, it does allow you to fill your roster a little bit neater and a little bit less sloppy, if that makes sense, because you aren't scrambling in the middle of the draft trying to figure out where you can pick up guys to replace the value that you lost in the second round because you went tight end. But that's it. That's all I got. Well, that is the wrong thing. But that's all I got for the San Francisco 49ers. This is just a super fascinating team because they reached a height last season that nobody thought they would. And now the question becomes, what is the actual truth about the San Francisco 49ers. So there's a lot of questions here, and it really just breaks down to how the running back shake out between Raheem Mostert and Tevin Coleman. Who gets the majority of the work, and what's that timeshare going to be? And then we're looking at the wide receivers. What does Brandon Aiyuk do if Deebo Samuel misses time? And where should you draft Deebo Samuel if we know that he is going to miss time compared to if he's not, right? That's just a super valid question. And then lastly, just the every year discussion, the annual discussion, that's what I'm looking for. The annual discussion of, is it worth it to draft a tight end super early in your fantasy draft? Once again, that's just a personal philosophy that's entirely dictated by you and how you see things through the lens of fantasy football. But that's going to be it for this episode of All-32. We wrap up the NFC West with the Los Angeles Rams tomorrow, so be sure to subscribe for that. Once again, leave a like on this video if you enjoyed. Be sure to share it with a friend as well, and text me 330-302-1554. And with that, I will see you next time. Remember, people come and go, but fantasy championships are forever. All right, I'm out. Peace.